Hey, what is up everybody, Platform Disciple here, and it's been a while since I've made a video, but let's just update you on everything that's going on. So I actually tried to record this video yesterday. I recorded it successfully, just to be clear, but it was like 40 minutes long, which is probably way too long for what it's supposed to be, which is a discussion of what I was using in ranked last month, a extremely strong deck. I came in 8th on the leaderboard. Of course, we can't see that anymore because it is the new month and I haven't played ranked then, but I came in 8th, which is pretty big deal, even given the small player base and the small number of people playing ranked. It's an indicator of at a bare minimum, the effort or time I spent grinding the ladder, but I think it also is an indicator of the strength of the deck or decks I was using. And I used quite a few decks, but when I started reaching higher and higher ranks, it was more important for me to be playing strong and consistent decks instead of just goofy fun decks, which is what I was doing for a very long time. So to preface me showing you the deck I was using, let's begin by saying that I did mention in the past at some point that the meta in any card game is kind of like an elaborate rock, paper, scissors, where there are certain deck types that beat other ones. And when you have a certain type being more prevalent than others, the player who plays the counter deck can very frequently reap the rewards. And let's begin by saying that there is a very, very strong deck that a lot of people have been playing, and I've heard that the name coined for it as Robohammer, which is named after Sacalus, presumably, because he is a hammer, and the robot portion, of course, is going to be the Genesis cards, notably Splitter Light. And you've probably seen this deck. It's popped up in a few of my videos, me playing against it, but it uses Chlor, Splitter Light, and Bromic in the command zone. And it takes advantage of cards like Taiga, and it's an all-around very powerful aggro deck. I may make a video after this one talking a little more about that, but the more important thing is just to know that that's a very strong and popular deck right now. And the second thing you need to know is that the deck I was playing, this deck right here, is so freaking good against the Robohammer deck. I mean, like, I don't think I lost a single match with this deck against the Robohammer deck. Maybe I lost like one game out of the best out of 3, but this deck is just so reliable against it. And of course, this deck is not bad against any other deck. Let's begin by just saying that the weakness of the deck is going to be mid-range decks. Notably, the Logarithmatron deck gives this deck a lot of trouble, because Logarithmatron's untouchable, gets a lot of health very quickly so that we can't really kill it, and Logarithmatron is going to get in one-shot range of us before we can play the Calamity, which is really the only guaranteed way to get rid of it. And in addition to that, this deck is a control deck and is very slow, so we will not be able to pressure our opponent and kill them before Logarithmatron is gonna kill us. So that's one of the main weaknesses. Other mid-range decks, like the Martyr of Life deck, also give this deck a lot of trouble. But it has very good matchups against most control decks and insanely good matchups against any aggro deck, at least in my experience. So let's cover all the cards in it and just, give you the rundown. So in the command zone, we have Tibat, and that is in part because he's just an insanely good card, but also in part because it gives us another Tibat. It essentially lets us have 4 Tibats in our deck, and as you can see, we have 3 more over here. And then we have Gauhan, the Stalwart. just a super effective anti-aggro card because he begins in play and your opponent is going to have to use resources to get rid of it, either by trading their characters into it or burning a removal spell. And you don't lose too much for having him against control decks because this deck tends to win slow games. And then lastly, we have Host to the Ancestors, which is an all-around super strong card, and also is more effective in longer games, and this deck tries to prolong the game. Also notable is that this card is very difficult for other control decks to deal with, and poses a legitimate threat to them because it can eat multiple removal spells potentially. Okay, so let's jump into the characters we have. We've got 3 Echo of the Battlefield, and this card is just, you're going to be noticing a trend here, which is that this deck is super, super anti-aggro, and this card does its job very well, which is that it plays itself for free if a character in your defense zone dies and goes straight to the defense zone. It's very easy for you to get characters in the defense zone. You start with Gauhan in the defense zone, and then you have many vigilance characters. So these come out for free and generally block or even kill small characters. And another perk worth noting is that it does have a morale cost of 0. And although it usually doesn't matter because we don't have many characters, it is worth noting that a lot of our characters, including Tibat, have kind of high morale costs, and having a character that doesn't have a morale cost is kind of nice. That leads us into Tibat, who we've already talked about because he's in the command zone. But Tibat is one of the most efficient characters in the game, and he's insanely good at what he does. He's got high health, 4 power is enough to kill most aggressive characters, vigilance, so he's going to immediately start stopping things from attacking, and an immediate impact effect, which is his 12 damage split among random characters, up to 4. I always forget about that bit, but point is he does a lot of damage immediately. He immediately probably kills something, maybe more things depending on what their board is, and also blocks anything that survived. Very nice effect, and we want as much of him as we can. We have 1 Z Ascended, and we only use 1 in the main deck because although this card is extremely good in certain matchups and in certain situations, if we're playing against a very aggressive deck, we don't really want to have more than 1 Z, or she, or whatever. But anyways, in control matchups, though, it's very good, and it's also not bad to have 1 during aggro matchups, because if you manage to stabilize by killing all their characters, you can actually outrace them, because for the most part, these aggressive decks don't have very much removal and don't have very good ways to deal with this card, which essentially, given enough time, is going to produce a very lethal amount of damage that is difficult to block. Alright, and then we have Agent Coil Immovable. This is going to be the toughest card for newer players to get their hands on, and I am using 3, and I do believe that 3 is how many you want. He is super, super, super good. He's got vigilance, he blocks basically 3 characters guaranteed, and then turning into a dragon sometimes does matter. Very rarely do I do that, but in certain control matchups, if the game's going super slow, sometimes you can take a whole turn to make a dragon, and then they actually have to deal with him because he could kill them pretty quickly. Okay, and the last card, this is very noteworthy, is Adaptive Ritualist. And this guy's kind of like a wild card is the way I think of him, because he lets us get more of whatever effect we need. Like if we're playing against an aggressive deck and we don't have a Tibat available, we can bring back one from the discard pile. If we're playing an aggressive decks and we need characters to defend with right now, then we can bring back an Echo of the Battlefield, which is going to go into our hand the same turn, and therefore can immediately happen the same turn that we deploy the Ritualist. If we need another Humble, another Calamity, you get the idea. He's kind of like a wild card. And that leads pretty well into the Gather Thoughts and the Recycle, which do a very similar thing, which is they let us put certain effects that we need more of back in our deck. And they also let us see more cards. And I think I mentioned at the beginning of the video that not only is this deck very powerful, but it's very consistent. And one of the things that plays into its consistency is the set of cards of Adaptive Ritualist, the Recycles, and the Gather Thoughts, because it gives us a very large amount of control over which cards we're going to be seeing throughout the game. And it basically means that it's very unlikely for us to get in a situation where we have a bad hand of cards that we can't fix, kind of, I guess is the way to look at it. That it's unlikely for us to get unlucky because we have so much control over what's actually in our deck and what's in our hand. Next, we have one Calamity, and I find myself not using it in most matches, but the matches where you do play it, generally speaking, it's super, super important. And the card's one of our only ways to defend ourselves from the mid-range decks, which is the main weakness of this deck. This is a good way for us to take care of the Martyr of Life decks if we can actually survive to that point. Next, we have Humble. This card's disgustingly good. Frequently, I play it on turn 2 just to shut down a difficult to deal with commander. But I will also bring up again this Robo Hammer aggro deck that uses the splitters. This card just completely shuts down Taiga, and also notably is that a lot of people against this deck are going to sideboard in cards like Noble Protector and Martyr Golem, very frequently both actually, and Humble basically completely ruins those cards. It's very, very difficult for your opponent to effectively sideboard when you have a card that is going to turn off their main counter tools. Yuan-Chi's Wrath is amazing. Not really much to say here. It just hoses any aggro deck at any stage of the game. Retaliation is in here just because we need some ways to deal with characters that aren't going to die to things like Tibat. And also notably, I guess there's a couple things to note. Like one card that we could have used instead of Retaliation would have been Demonize, because it's also single target removal. But Retaliation can hit things that are not on the battlefield, and also has some pretty interesting things it can do, like it can kill Sackless the turn he comes out, or the turn after he comes out, because he technically damaged you with his ability. That's right. Interestingly enough, this card does not care whether it's combat damage or damage from abilities, so that can be pretty useful sometime. We're going to skip Gather the Weak for a second and come back to that. And we're just going to talk about Spontaneous Combustion, which is basically our 5th, 6th, and 7th copy of Tibat. And in the combination with the Recycles and the Gather Thoughts and the Adaptive Ritualists, we basically can have a Tibat or Spontaneous Combustion like every single turn and effectively lock our opponent out of the game. Next, Gather the Weak. The reason I skipped this is because it really has to be talked about in the context of Contained Parallel Rift, which is a card that shuffles, or excuse me, does not shuffle, places our hand on the bottom of our deck, and then we draw new cards every turn. And I corrected myself on the shuffle because this is very important, that it actually, after a certain point of putting your hands back into your deck, you can start to kind of predict which cards are going to be showing up. Like, for example, if you just had a Calamity in your hand, you know it went to the bottom of your deck. You know you're not going to draw it in your next hand. It's kind of a pretty useful tool. And once again, that helps keep our deck super consistent because we know what we're expecting. We get to see a very high number of cards. And what Gather the Weak, what this does for us is it adds 3 pieces of junk into our hand that at the end of the turn are exchanged for legitimate cards that we need. And the Demonic Disciples are not completely useless to us. They can defend, they can attack, they can be overcharged to the Ritualists, but the main reason we care about this card is because of the immediate increase in the number of cards we see, which is very important. And the last card in the deck, maybe one of the most important, is Shunhal's Urn. And this card is our guaranteed win condition. Although we can win with morale against certain decks, like the Robohammer deck, by playing Tibats and Spontaneous Combustions, Shunhal's Urn puts a time limit on the game so your opponent can't stall you out. And it's just so good against control decks because they have so little ways to interact with it. And I already said it, but yeah, it puts a time limit on the aggro decks so they can't just wait until you burn through your resources. And now we're going to talk about the sideboard, which is of course very important for ranked. We've got 2 Vandalizes, which is a very weak card usually, but one of the decks that can beat us is going to be other Shunhal Urn decks, and being able to kill their urn and keep our urn alive is very important. So important that we can justify using a really crappy card. And also, when you're both playing urn decks, you're both running such a slow strategy that putting 6 resources into killing their urn isn't actually that bad. We've got Repair, and that's mostly to deal with the Death Blast decks, because although we can kill all their characters very easily, sometimes they can just burn us out, and it helps to have a little way to put some health back in. Then we've got Graverob, and interestingly enough, I'm not using this to deal with the sleepers nearly as much as control decks. Like, we don't want our opponent to be playing multiple acquires by using recycles and stuff, and this is going to shut that down by just getting rid of them. Also, in the mirror match when we're playing against other urn decks, removing their Vandalizes from the graveyard is very important, because once we do that, then we can recycle our urns, and then they don't have a way to deal with them. Okay, and we've got 2 more Z Ascendeds, which do what we already discussed, which is that they just hose control decks super hard. And yeah, it just applies a lot of pressure, but we don't want to use it against aggro decks too much. And then last card, pretty funny one, is the Seer. And what's great about him is no one really expects you to be playing it, but he's kind of like Shunhal's Urn in a lot of ways, because he does 10 damage, and it's hard for your opponent to interact with that 10 damage. And if they don't have many characters, they can't choose to sacrifice a character. So he's very good against other control decks. He's also pretty good against mid-range decks that don't use many characters. I just like him a lot, actually. Especially like since the rework, I mean. So he costs 1 more than the Shunhal's Urn. Potentially does the same effect of 10 damage a turn, and in addition, he's a 22/22 flyer, which is going to scare your opponent. They have to use resources to kill him. So that's the whole deck. Super strong deck, insanely good against aggro. As long as people are playing aggro decks in ranked, this deck is a very good deck to be trying to be competitive with. And the last thing I kind of want to say about this is actually in the store, for you players who are a little newer, there's a very easy way for you to kind of jump into playing the deck I just showed you, because this card list has a very large number of the cards you need to be playing the deck, the Tibat Shunhal's deck. Because this comes with Gauhan, one of the commanders. We've got a Z in there. Some of the cards we don't use, but we've got 3 Tibats here. We've got the Adaptive Ritualist, so we have 2 Shunhao's urns, 3 Yuan-Chis. We've got so the Spontaneous Combustions. So it's a pretty good place to start and a fairly low price. And it gives you a deck that is pretty similar. It's not exactly the same because this one is more of like an aggro mid-range deck, whereas what I just showed you was actually like a super hard control deck. But yeah, very good deck. I wholeheartedly recommend it. It got me to 8th on the leaderboard, and this also will probably lead me into a discussion of this Robo Hammer deck that everyone thinks is super broken, even though this deck wins 95% of the games against it. But that's a whole different discussion. So until next time, everybody, hope you enjoyed the video. Peace out.